sanctions we oppose exceed anything that's ever been done.
As the United States and other Western countries impose severe new sanctions on Russia following its military escalation in Ukraine, sanctions in Afghanistan continue to have a devastating humanitarian impact. So why have sanctions become such a standard feature of U.S. foreign policy? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Over the last few decades, economic sanctions have been a major feature of U.S. foreign policy, despite the fact that they rarely, if ever, succeed in achieving stated policy goals. Instead, they tend to harm the most vulnerable people in target countries. As the U.S. completed its military withdrawal from Afghanistan last year, it froze Afghan central bank assets, some $7 billion held by the U.S., to prevent the Taliban from using government funds after their takeover of Kabul. The freezing of $9.4 billion in total by the U.S. and its partners has also prevented foreign donors from sending money to Afghanistan and locked Afghan citizens out of their bank accounts, starving the country of liquidity. In just a few moments, I'll be speaking with the UN's humanitarian chief, Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths. But first, our correspondent in Kabul, Soraya Leni, takes a look at an orphanage that had to close down and a maternity hospital that is struggling to stay open.
در حدود 500 الی 600 مریض اوپیدی داریم در 4 بخش مختلف که اوپیدی ولادی است، اوپیدی نسایی، داخله و جراحی عمومی. فعلا خود در تمام بازار کابل میفهمید که راهها بند است. دواها هم قیمت شدن، هم بدون کیفیت شدن، هم کمیاب شدن. مشکلات و ما بسیار زیاد است. ما قبلا هم در مثلا سرنج، دستکش بر مریضای خود نداشتیم، اما ما مجبور هستیم، شفاخانه امکانات نداره. مادرمو خودشان میارن سرنج، دستکش و ضروریات دیگه که میشن از اون استفاده میکنیم. فی الحال که ما را IRC و کمک میکنه، ما تونستیم که یک مقدار دوایی بر ما روان کردن، مشکلات ما حل شده. اگر این کمک نباشه، شفاخانه بسته میشه.
Six months ago, when this government came, the Taliban came, I had almost 18,000 euro in my bank account, and they closed that. The bank has no money to pay me, and since months we closed the center because the money was not arrived. American is very, very rich country. He can help those people who harmful in 9/11. In 9/11 is not our fault. If they are outside, nobody is interesting for them to make them in school or university or something like this. No, they are poor people, you know. They must work with mechanics or the daily selling something. They are openly running on the street.
So will the U.S. change course? For now, the Biden administration continues to pursue a policy that would likely deepen the humanitarian suffering of the Afghan people, stating earlier this month that it would use $3.5 billion of the frozen Afghan assets to partially fund the legal settlement of the families of American victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Martin Griffiths, who was the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for Yemen until July of last year, is the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. He held talks with the Taliban last September after their takeover of Kabul. He joins me now from New York. Under-Secretary General Griffiths, it's good to have you on the program. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks so much.
We just saw a graphic and painful illustration of Afghanistan's daily hardships, which you are all too familiar with and probably have seen those hardships firsthand on your visits to the country. How would you describe the situation in Afghanistan today? Is the suffering easing at all in any way? Are we seeing more aid getting in? What is the humanitarian situation like?
Well, I like to quote the Secretary General, who described it the other day as Afghanistan hanging by a thread, and I've described it as Afghanistan in free fall. So while it's certainly true that there's more humanitarian aid getting through, it's better distributed through the country because the security is better around Afghanistan. It's by no means over yet, and as your piece suggests, the family level of distress and suffering and tragedy is as high now as ever. So we may have avoided the worst through this winter, but we are by no means out of the woods. We have a huge amount to do.
And you said in December that Afghanistan was on the brink of total collapse. You again warned just last month, in fact, in an op-ed that you co-wrote with the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, that, quote, by the end of this winter, almost the entire country, 97% of the population could be too poor to survive without aid. Is anyone listening? And who is responsible for this situation?
Well, I think, first of all, people are beginning to listen, and there's been a huge effort by civil society, by Afghans, of course, in the lead, and by those of us involved in the humanitarian community to bring these truths home to people in the West and in member states and governments and donors who need to be generous. As you know, Afghanistan was propped up by international assistance for many, many years. And on the 30th of August, those props were taken away. The banking system froze. The assets for the central bank froze also. And services also were damaged. Public civil servants have not been paid except through aid. So it's almost impossible to imagine the catastrophe that hit that country on that day in the end of August, the beginning of September. And I went there a few days later to talk to the Taliban, the new rulers. And we realized as we went through these last months of last year that, as that op-ed suggested, we're facing an economic collapse unprecedented, even in Afghanistan, which has gone through such terrible times. We know, however, what we need to do to get it back on track. And largely, I think most governments are beginning to accept the arguments that we've been making about what needs to be done.
Are they, though? I mean, as you point out, I mean, the situation, economic and humanitarian situation, has been dire for a long time. The economic situation was a disaster well before the Taliban took over, but the sanctions policy, it seems, the freezing of billions of dollars in Afghan funds, seems to be what broke the camel's back, is it not?
Well, those funds, and it's about 9 billion, isn't it, in the assets that are there to stabilize the Afghan economy through the central bank which hasn't been functioning, of course, since the end of August. Those funds, we recently saw an announcement in Washington that 3.5 billion, at least, of that 9 billion should be made available. But there's a lot of procedures that they have to go through. We take the view that that's a good step forward. It's for the people of Afghanistan to decide how that money is to be spent. Indeed, that it should be spent to capitalize the banking system so that the business community, that the small traders, so that the farmers can go back to work and start their livelihoods again. That's what those assets are for. And it's fundamentally important and a priority. It's in addition to the aid money that we need to bring in.
And the remaining $3.5 billion that are held here in the United States, the Biden administration has pointed out, will go towards helping the victims of the 9/11 attacks. In other words, to settle legal claims against the Taliban. Does the United Nations feel that this is legal, that it is moral, that it is appropriate?
Well, I take no position on the legality of that at all, and I'm not in a position to say so.
Legality aside, from a humanitarian moral perspective,
Well,
is it
from
right?
that perspective, what we believe very strongly is that all the frozen assets should be made available to the people of Afghanistan, as I just said, and that includes all those assets. I've no doubt there are litigations in prospect against the Taliban or the former administration of Afghanistan. That's not for me to say. But what I'm saying is that the assets, which are not only in the United States, but they're also in Europe, they're also in the Gulf, all of these assets need to be unfrozen, provided back through a central bank system to jumpstart the economy. That's a priority. It's interestingly, it's also a humanitarian priority.
Are you calling on the US government and other governments to unfreeze these assets immediately? Is the UN Secretary General taking that stand as well? Because we don't often hear him use the megaphone that he's got. It's rather silent. But are you calling on the US government and others to unfreeze these funds?
Well, we have done so, yes, for some time. And Peter Maurer, the president of ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I jointly did a whole series of meetings, particularly with US officials and politicians in Washington, but also elsewhere, about what needs to be done to jumpstart that economy that I mentioned. And one of the aspects is certainly unfreezing those assets. Those assets are money essentially belonging to the people of Afghanistan. We welcomed the fact last week that $3.5 billion at least was beginning to move. But of course, we want to see the whole lot made available. And we want to see it done in a way that's consistent with the legal obligations that money brings to the Central Bank of Afghanistan. Fundamental to this is a functioning technocratic central bank. That's of the highest importance. The US administration, by the way, has been extremely helpful, their Treasury Department, to helping us make that happen. So,
well, you say they've been helpful, though, Mr. Griffiths, but I mean, the US has also been withholding $7 billion here in the United States of Afghan funds. Not only that, they've also put quite a bit of pressure on UN agencies, on the World Bank, on the IMF, on other countries to not unfreeze Afghan assets. That's not exactly being very helpful, is it?
Well, I'm not aware that they have been putting pressure on others not to unfreeze assets. I haven't seen that.
Let me just quote something that you wrote in that op-ed as well. You said, just when the Afghan people need more help, they're being denied even the basics. You say it is a high price to pay for being ruled by the Taliban. It's a high price indeed. In fact, it's a cruel price. It's an indirect but quite explicit criticism, though, of US sanctions and even United Nations Security Council sanctions. You seem to be speaking truth to power, but are others willing to put their money where their mouth is and call a spade a spade?
Well, one of the things that is easy for people like me to say, but is true, is that the Afghan people shouldn't suffer twice. If the people of Afghanistan get half a chance to live on safely in Afghanistan, what did not happen at the end of August was the worried about anticipated outflow of Afghans into the region, out of Afghanistan. They didn't do that. They stayed at home because they want to stay in Afghanistan. We got to give them the means to keep that promise and stay home, stay in Afghanistan, and make that place the home that they want to live in. We have that chance.
But again, how likely is it to happen? Because you pointed out that Afghans now face destitution, even famine, you say, on a dramatic scale. Why aren't we seeing more countries then willing to step up to help?
Well, we are going to hold a co-hosted with the United Kingdom and others, a pledging conference in the end of March for Afghanistan. We have the largest ever humanitarian program ever put together in the history of recent humanitarianism, $4.5 billion for 2022 alone. I hope we'll see a generous donation from around the world. The US has already pledged considerable sums, up to 800 million. So I'm hoping this will work. But, and here's the point of that op-ed and our advocacy, this humanitarian aid will only work if we have an economy that works, if we have liquidity in the system if Afghanis, the local currency, are available so that those frontline health workers and teachers can actually be paid to do the necessary jobs that we all want them to do. So we have to get economic recovery even to support humanitarian aid.
All right, Martin Griffiths, UN Under-Secretary General, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
It isn't just Afghanistan where US sanctions against the Taliban were imposed in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. Over the last 5 decades, the United States has imposed economic sanctions on various countries in an effort to bring about regime change and/or punish governments for their policies. Today, the US maintains sanctions on more than 20 countries, including Russia, Iran, Syria, Cuba, North Korea, and Venezuela. With little evidence to suggest that its long-standing sanctions policy has achieved any of its stated aims, why does the US government continue to maintain sanctions regimes and even impose new ones? Why have the number of people and entities sanctioned by the US increased nearly 1,000% in the last 20 years? Here are our 5 facts. Sanctions have limited effect on targeted economies. With a few exceptions, they cause less than a 2% GDP contraction. Sanctions rarely bring down governments, according to former US Treasury official Gary Hufbauer. If the target country is a large country which has a very strong leader and has no internal political dissent or conflict, then in those circumstances, the sanctions are unlikely to produce regime change. Unilateral sanctions are less likely to work than multilateral ones. 38% of sanctions since 1970 managed some success. That dropped to less than 20% if the sanctions were unilateral. They often make a sanctioned government more defiant. In fact, they work better on allies than enemies. And sanctions often have severe harmful effects on public health. In Iraq, malnutrition of children under 5 rose by 10% from 1990 to 1996. An estimated 500,000 children died as a result of UN sanctions. In Haiti, the number of underweight newborns rose 5% from 1990 to 1994. Columbia University professor Richard Garfield estimated that between 1991 and 2002, the number of excess deaths in Iraq among children under the age of 5 was between 343,000 and 525. So how does the US, which slaps more economic sanctions than any other country, decide when and how to use them? Are they, as some have argued, simply a better alternative than waging war? Or are punishing sanctions a blunt instrument that can cause indiscriminate hardships and inflict more death than a war's so-called collateral damage? I'm joined by Adam Smith, who served as senior advisor during the Obama administration to the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, Ofac, which administers US sanctions regimes. Adam Smith, for years, if not decades, sanctions have become, it seems, one of the preferred tools of US foreign policy. When you look at the case of Afghanistan, sanctions against the Taliban have been in place for 2 decades now, in fact, since the attacks of 9/11. The Afghan economy has collapsed, and you could argue the collapse started way before the Taliban takeover if it weren't for direct budget assistance that was provided by donors. Afghanistan's economy has been on life support for some time, but Afghanistan's official foreign reserves that are held in the US amount to over $7 billion. These funds were frozen once the Taliban took power in Kabul. Can the US government legally restrict Afghanistan's access to these funds? How do existing US sanctions under US law govern funds that belong to Afghanistan?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me. And it's a very good question and a very timely question. The reality is that in some respects, the funds that are at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which of course, Afghanistan is not alone here. Many countries around the world keep some of their foreign reserves in New York for safekeeping. So that's not that strange. The issue with respect to the funds is actually less to do with sanctions, at least to start with, than it is to do with the lack of recognition of the Taliban as the head of Afghanistan. The funds at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York are held in the name of the Central Bank of Afghanistan. The Central Bank of Afghanistan, of course, is the official bank of Afghanistan, and Afghanistan as a country is now being run by the Taliban. The United States does not recognize the Taliban's leadership of Afghanistan.
But should, at the very least, the US Congress get involved in crafting new strategies to retain pressure on the Taliban without needlessly punishing Afghans, all the more that the US essentially handed over the keys to the Taliban when it left Afghanistan, when it signed the Doha Agreement with the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, namely the Taliban.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the United States is both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Congress and the executive, I know, are working very hard on this very issue. And Congress, it has an important role to play, but at the end of the day, it's the president and the executive branch that actually controls the way sanctions are implemented. And I do know that they are working very hard on figuring out what else they can be providing to Afghanistan. I mean, there are three levels here, right? One is the basic humanitarian needs, which the sanctions are now allowing in, right? Actual money flowing for food and medicine and whatnot. Then you have development type needs, education and these sort of things, which are yet to be really being provided significantly. And then you have livelihoods, right? The support of small business and commerce, which is the third level, right? It's perhaps the way you get the economy back on track. As of now, the sanctions have been lifted. Lifting is not the right word, but eased and interpreted to allow a large amount of humanitarian aid in, but very little development and almost no commercial aid. So the likelihood of saving livelihoods in addition to saving lives is very, very low based upon the way the sanctions currently are structured.
But it isn't just Afghanistan. The Taliban were sanctioned for 20 years. It didn't do anything to weaken them. Quite the opposite. They came back to power. And look at other countries as well. Yemen, US sanctions on the Houthis have pushed millions of people into famine. Take the example of Syria. Despite a sanctions regime there too, President Assad is still in power. And in fact, it was President Obama, when you were a part of the administration in 2011, when he announced that Assad, quote, was, Assad must go, who signed an executive order that froze the assets of the regime, prohibited the importation of oil as well, and made it illegal for any American to invest in Syria or do business with the government. We've seen the devastating humanitarian effects, not just on Syria, but across the world. Take other examples as well. Can you point to any one place where sanctions have actually worked?
Well, it depends on what you mean by work, right? Because there's a very sort of, you could sort of make certain arguments about whether they worked in the context, for instance, of the nuclear deal in Iran, right? Or the relief of apartheid in South Africa, or the encouragement of Libya back in 2003 to give up its nuclear weapons. All of that arguably was very much directly associated with sanctions working. Similarly,
that's from the U.S. perspective, though. That's from the U.S. perspective. But look at the case of Cuba. The Communist Party is still there, still in charge, despite a 60-year-old embargo that has cost Cuba at least $130 billion, according to the UN. Iran, same story. You've had sanctions, unilateral sanctions for the past 40 years. The regime is still in place. The Islamic Republic is still thriving, no matter what. Despite the economic, trade, scientific, and military sanctions you've slapped on the government there. So what is the end result? More of the same?
Well, no, one could argue that they got to the original nuclear deal back in 2016, the implementation of that deal, because of sanctions. So I don't think anyone's suggesting that we were going to sort of overthrow the government in Tehran through the sanctions. That wasn't the goal of the sanctions, and it certainly wasn't the impact. But getting them to the table to do the original JCPOA, that was very much a product of sanctions, bilateral, unilateral, and multilateral. So I do think that's right.
Well, look at the example of Crimea and Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. The sanctions that were imposed on the Kremlin had no impact. They did not lead to any reversal of policy on the part of the Russians.
It might have been. They may have not stopped in Crimea in 2014. They may have gone to Kiev, is what I'm saying. And there are people in Ukraine who think that's very clear, that if not for the threat of those sanctions imposed on Crimea, imposed on people next to President Putin, he would have already been in Kiev. So it's a kind of historical that's hard to prove one way or the other, but that's certainly an argument that sanctions worked there, even if they didn't do all that we would have hoped they've done, namely ask him to leave Crimea again.
But it isn't just that. Looking at it from a historical perspective, North Korea, you've had sanctions in place since the 1950s. Iraq in the 1990s, you could argue the impact of sanctions was a lot of loss of life. Venezuela, since 2019, in fact, there have been sanctions imposed on the entire government. And now the US is considering more sanctions on Russia. Where does it ever stop?
Well, it might not ever stop. This is a very important tool for the United States. Is it being overused? Potentially. You could certainly make the argument. The United States, I know, is very concerned about the threat of overuse of sanctions because there's some real problems if it gets overused. But I think the other reality is that there aren't that many other tools that are not violent that can allow the United States and others, the UN, the EU, to exercise coercive authority and coercive threats without risking life and limb. And so sanctions, I'm not suggesting there aren't collateral consequences, because there clearly are. But one could argue that collateral consequences are less devastating than if there was a war or bombing or some other sort of consequence that sanctions are often used to prevent.
All right, Adam Smith, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Sanctions are a modern-day tool of ancient war tactics, sieges, whose purpose was to starve the enemy into submission. Sanctions have the same purpose, but rarely the same effect. And yet, it is the United States, and more broadly, the West's foreign policy tool of choice in addressing conflicts. But sanctions rarely yield the intended results. In fact, they tend to deepen and prolong crises and place protagonists in foxholes from which they often struggle to get out. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri, and the team. Thanks for watching. See you next time.